Rise of Kingdoms and I think about the feedback I always get about what people think of the game, the one thing I hear the most is Rise of Kingdoms is pay to win. And today, I'm going to actually be looking at Rise of Kingdoms from an unbiased perspective. Do I think the game is pay to win? Do I think the game is free to play? I've played a little bit free to play. Most of the time I've played as a medium to low spender. So I've been looking at the advantages of spending money in the game. What is the difference between the free to play and pay to win gap? Is it really as bad as people say it is? And if it is, how can it be improved? So interested in the current state of Rise of Kingdoms for free to play and even spending players? You want to stick around to the end of the video. Now, I'm going to start off by saying, what would a game that is free to play friendly look like? And of course, I'm not saying that there should be no in-app purchases. Rise of Kingdoms is a business. At the end of the day, they need to make money. If you want to play the game, they need money because they're not doing this for charity. And that is just the logical side of it. So I think a free-to-play friendly game is a game where you're looking at being able to achieve the exact same things or the same things to nearly the same degree as someone who spends, but it is going to take more time and more effort. And for that to be achieved, you need to have access to relatively adequate amount of items, and you need to be able to play the game a lot. Now, Rise of Kingdoms definitely allows you to play the game a lot, but there are some restrictions that lower spenders or even free-to-players may have. The first one that is really big is going to be your resources. If you don't spend money, there's really a limit on how many resources you could grind per KVK. If especially you're not running a farm account, you can only have so many marches in a resource deposit at once. And this is only a small disadvantage between free-to-plays and pay-to-wins. You're not going to have as many resources. Now, this disadvantage isn't too big, but people who will spend a bit of money will just gradually over time, they might get an extra 2, 3, 400 million resources if they're buying bundles. Now, that's not a huge amount in Rise of Kingdoms terms, and most free-to-play low spenders can make up with it in terms of having a farm account. So I think resources are not a very big disparity between pay-to-win and free-to-plays. The only time this becomes a problem is when we talk about resource selling. People who are selling resources, completely different dynamic, but we're talking about within terms of service here. I'm not going to look at going out of that. If people are buying resources, obviously you can get billions for like $10. I think the amount was people who sell resources, I think it's like $1 billion for $10 or $1 billion for 20. I think it depends on which kingdom you're in, but resource selling is huge in Rise of Kingdoms, and when it comes down to it, pay to win, free to play, there can be a huge disparity there if people are buying resources. But in terms of, I'm going to say, legal or terms of service friendly ways to do it, getting resources generally through bundles isn't too bad. It isn't going to make the biggest difference between accounts. Obviously, there will be a slight difference over time, but generally free-to-players can earn the same amount of resources. Speed-ups, I think, are also relatively fair between both pay-to-wins and low spenders. And you might say, why would I say that is? Well, you can see my account right now, and I don't buy many big bundles. The only thing I really buy are the 30-day supplies, and every now and again, I'll buy some gold head or equipment bundles, and that is it. I do not have more resources than most free-to-play. Sorry, more speed-ups than most free-to-plays I know. I'm stacked on speed-ups, don't get me wrong, but in total, I have a grand total of 718 days worth of generic speed-ups. I've seen free-to-plays with upwards of 3,000 days, and that's because if you're a free-to-play low spender, you do have the ability to get a ton of speed-ups. Either you're in an alliance where people do spend money, and obviously that is a bit pay-to-win, but generally, there's in most kingdoms, someone will spend some amount of money. I'm not in the main alliance right now, but if I was, there'd be more chests in here with more speed-ups. That is just the simple part of it. You've also got other bonuses like the treasures, the crystal treasures. Each barbarian fort you destroy, you're going to get points towards this treasure of the crystal, which is going to give you speed-ups. And the main thing for free-to-play low spenders, again, I said that free-to-play should be able to do the same thing as a pay-to-win, but use more time. You have access to do AoE barb farming. If you're a free-to-play low spender and you AoE barb farm, you can get a crazy amount of speed-ups, more than enough for generally any massive KVK you're in, to the point where you can zero yourself and not have used all your speed-ups on healing your troops. So I think that right now, speed-ups also are not a very big issue between free-to-plays and also people who spend money. Now, I will put a statement out there and say this: when it comes down to people spending money, it is much easier for them to get access to speed-ups. You don't have to spend hours AoE barb grinding, but if you are a free-to-play low spender, you do have that option, and in my opinion, that is free-to-play. Speed-ups are not really locked behind a paywall. You can get access to a near unlimited amount if you AoE barb farm really well. So most hype people who spend money may just choose not to AoE barb farm because they have that chance, they've spent the money, they do get a convenience where they technically don't have to play the game as much, but free-to-play low spenders can access a really similar amount of speed-ups if you are willing to give that time out of your day and do the AoE barb farming. So again, I think free-to-plays in terms of speed-ups and resources are relatively close to pay-to-win players. Now, obviously, people who are on the topper ends of pay to win where they're maxing every single bundle, they're a different story. But that is the ridiculous end of Rise of Kingdoms, where I'm not going to compare most people. I'm talking about people who would spend a medium to a slightly high spender and a low spender compared to someone who's free to play. Someone like Baba or someone like, let's say, Shower King, who is the top power player in my kingdom, they're going to definitely have a lot more speed ups than the general player, but they're spending ridiculous amounts of money. I've seen Shower King drop like 4 gold chests in one day. I've seen Shogun, our second biggest player, drop like 5 gold chests in a day. There's tons of gold chests coming out of these guys. But in terms of normal people who don't spend that much money on the game, it is a bit different, and in my opinion, still relatively equal for the majority of the player base. The last real thing we'll look at is where it starts to get a little bit more pay to win. It's going to be commanders, your equipment, and your armaments. Those 3 things are, in my opinion, the biggest part of Rise of Kingdoms, and they have the largest impact, where pay-to-wins do get the biggest advantage. Starting off with commanders, free-to-players cannot earn nearly the same amount of gold sculptures as someone who spends money. It's as simple as that. Someone who's going to spend money is going to get a lot more gold sculptures. It won't even be close. And you might be wondering, why is that the case? Well, I'm sure you're not really wondering, but there are a ton of bundles that over the year will give you around 700 to even 1,000 more gold sculptures if you're willing to spend a lot more money. Now, I think generally I'm able to get maybe up to 200-300 more gold sculptures than someone who doesn't spend any money each year, because I'll spend during recharge events. I'll get the History or Hunter of History bundle, which is just going to give you 10 gold sculptures. I'm probably butchering the name or forgetting the name there, but the one where you unlock a new commander. And I'm also going to have a higher VIP level than a lot of lower people who don't spend money. Now, you can get really high VIP levels if you don't spend money. I get access to more gems though, which allows me to get access to higher VIP, therefore more legendary commander sculptures. It is definitely a situation where pay-to-win players or someone who even just spends a little bit of money each year, I maybe spend 200 Australian, 170 or 140 US each year on the game. Now, that is not a lot of money, but I do get a huge advantage in gold sculptures, and I also get a decent advantage in equipment, mainly, again, because of VIP, I get material choice chests, but there are a few bundles, again, as well. If I form a new blueprint, a legendary blueprint that I've never formed before, I have the ability to buy those fragments out of the shop, which means I can get 4-5 more legendary materials that a normal player would have access to. And there is really no way to fully accelerate this. As a low spender or free to play, you can AoE barb farm for materials, but it is way slower. It's not even close to the speed of speed ups. You will get some materials, you just won't get nearly the same amount as you would as someone who's just willing to spend that little bit of extra money. Of course, the more money you spend, the more materials you're going to get, so that's going to make that disparity even bigger the more money you spend, but generally that's not really going to happen at a ridiculous level. But that being said, I find I can expertise about half a commander extra per year than a normal free-to-play or low spender, and really high power players who might spend even more than me, since I don't do every recharge event, but let's say someone who does do every recharge event and someone who will buy every single bundle that pops up with gold sculptures generally can expertise 1 to 2 more commanders than a free-to-play low spender. This amount goes up when it comes down to gems. Gems in Rise of Kingdoms, they don't give you as much in terms of speed ups and resources, but they give you a hell of a lot in terms of gold sculptures. I must flip the camera off. Hell of a lot in terms of gold sculptures and a hell of a lot in terms of materials. Those 2 things really are powered up by your gems. You can get like 100, 200 gold sculptures by spinning the wheel and max spinning it each time. Most free-to-play low spenders cannot get the same amount of gems as someone who's willing to spend money, because AoE barb farming, while it does give gems, doesn't give as many gems. So that means you cannot earn nearly as many gems as someone who spends money, especially if someone is just purchasing that supply depot bundle for the whole year. In those situations, they're going to earn a lot more gems. I've earned way more gems through the supply depot than I ever would have from just barb farming and being a normal player. I know at some point my 30-day gem supply ran out. I thought I'd try it out and see what happens, just not running it. I got maybe like 7-8k gems in that month. Now, you can gather gems if you're a low spender free to play, but that is the most ridiculous amount of time. You're going to have to be really dedicated to the game, and I think it's relatively unreasonable for me to assume that most free to play low spenders, or most free to plays in general, will be spending most of their day grinding out 2,000 gems. People have lives, people have jobs. Unless you're just staying home playing Rise of Kingdoms, you're not going to really have the ability to get those 2,000 gems a day and earn the 650 gems I get by just logging in if I'm willing to spend money. And that gets way more crazy when it comes down to people who might buy the daily special offer every day. That's an extra 1,200 gems. And someone who will buy the super values every now and again, they're just going to get more gems than you. And it is as simple as that. So when it comes down, lower spender, free-to-play players, you're generally not going to get as many gems, which means less materials, less equipment, and less gold heads, And finally, it means less armaments. Armaments have been seeing a bit of a rise in terms of events where you can spend gems on them, and armaments have also seen a rise in bundles where you can buy them. So generally, free-to-play low spenders cannot get as many armaments as a higher spender player. Now, the biggest thing I see with armaments, very big players tend to get a ton of armaments, and that's just because they're willing to spend the gems on events, and they're also getting access to a lot of super value bundles. Most medium to low spenders don't buy super value bundles because, contrary to the name, they're not super value. They're like mid value at best, which means most people who are playing Rise of Kingdoms will not get nearly as many armaments if they aren't spending a large amount of money. And that's where I see the biggest gap between free-to-play low spenders to medium to high spenders who are willing to spend a bit of money on that super value bundle. They get a lot more armaments and it gives them a huge advantage. So I think the biggest gap right now in Rise of Kingdoms would be the equipment, the gold heads, and also the armaments being probably the biggest main one. The final thing we should look at, and this is definitely the most controversial, is crystal tech in KVKs. Is it really as bad as people say? And does it really give that big of an advantage? And I think the very simple answer is crystal tech is massive. It is probably the biggest disparity between low spender and also people who spend money, because the amount of power you get from crystal tech is absurd. Someone who's really lazy with crystal tech, i.e. me, I'm very bad at grinding out the crystal tech, you get a massive disadvantage compared to someone who's willing to spend a lot of money on it. If someone maxes their crystal tech, they get like triple the troop, well not triple, they get about double the troop capacity, they get massive all damage bonuses, they get massive march speed bonuses, they get massive attack bonuses, not to mention they also get other bonuses such as if you spend a bit of money early, you can earn a bunch more crystals, which makes your crystal tech even better. It is where you see the biggest disparity between free-to-play, low spender, and whales. People who are willing to spend that money on crystal tech generally can get a massive advantage compared to the normal player. So crystal tech, in my opinion, is probably the biggest issue, especially when it comes down to those later KVKs. Lower spenders generally have a much worse time when it comes to getting crystal tech, because you're going to just get A, less crystals at the start, which over the long run means you're going to get less crystals in the KVK, and B, you're going to get really, really wrecked during those initial stages of the KVK, because of people who are spending money will have way higher crystal tech, and because stats in Rise of Kingdoms are compounding, they're going to have much higher stats than you, and during that start, because you have way lower stats, they're going to get much better trades than you. So I think that in that situation, there's a massive disparity between free-to-plays and people who are willing to spend money. So now, what if we look at the full breakdown of the advantages for pay-to-win players? How impactful are they actually are? And I've already spoken about the impact of crystal tech. I think it is the most pungent of every single one, but the rest I don't think are as impactful. As a free-to-play player, you can easily expertise around 2 commanders per year, and generally, that is enough commanders to give yourself a proper 2 to 3 marches over the course of 3 years of your account. The older your account, the easier it is to be closer to pay-to-win players, and generally, most free-to-play accounts that are older will be able to have a good mutable they can just cycle through as more commanders release. So this means I think the commander thing, even though I can expertise personally an extra half, even an extra whole commander per year compared to a free-to-play low spender, I think that it is relatively equal on the commander front. It is fine to be a free-to-play low spender and still be able to get access to a good amount of commanders. The same thing I would even say for equipment. Now, I think right now the equipment disparity is pretty big between free-to-plays and pay-to-wins, with the main reason just being the refining and the new attributes added to it. So most whale accounts will already have all this max for at least 1 or 2 sets of equipment. Free-to-plays, you've probably got like a few items at level 2, a couple at level 3, but over time, that gap will slowly close because people will be able to level their equipment up more. So equipment is one of those things that if it keeps progressing and constantly getting upgraded, the gap will slowly decrease or slowly increase. But if it slows down and the free-to-players are allowed to catch up, that gap between pay-to-wins and free-to-players on equipment will decrease to the point where it's pretty much equal. Before they added the whole new refinement system, I was able to contend with some pay-to-win players on my equipment level. The only thing I was missing was special talents, and they're not as powerful as the refining. And when you add refining and special talents, it does get a bit of a bigger gap. But generally, again, equipment you can kind of keep up on. Over time, you will just catch up, because eventually pay-to-win players just won't have a need to buy equipment, because they'll pretty much have most of it maxed, or if not maxed, very close to max. So equipment, a very, very similar thing. Armaments, again, over time, will gradually catch up to pay-to-win players, and again, I don't think it's the biggest issue. So when you look at it, yes, pay-to-wins do get an advantage in commanders. They can get absolute meta commanders all the time. They do get an advantage in equipment. They can constantly keep up with equipment meta. They do get an advantage in their armaments. They can definitely keep up with some of the strongest armaments in the game, and they can get the highest stats. But eventually, free-to-play low spenders can catch up to that, and if they use their stuff a little bit smarter, they invest in the correct commanders and skip ones that are not the biggest upgrade, you can generally keep up to pay-to-win players at a relatively good level. So I think that commanders are not the most impactful. Even the power in your city, a lot of pay-to-wins have way more power. It's not that impactful because at the end of the day, power is pretty much meaningless in Rise of Kingdoms. It just means how many troops you should kill, and no one truly cares about that. The one thing that truly does matter is the crystal tech, and I think it is the biggest disparity between free-to-play low spenders and people who are willing to spend money. So crystal tech is probably the only real big, I would say, changer that makes pay-to-wins get a huge advantage over free-to-play low spenders. The rest of the stuff, it's really meaningless. It's a max 10-15% advantage for someone who's willing to spend money, and if you're fighting in a group mutable and you're fighting with other people who spend money, generally that equalizes out. You pretty much end at a level playing field, and it just comes down to which kingdom is more active, which kingdom has more players, and which one has better leadership who are able to conduct their open field really well. In those situations, you'll see a kingdom that's going to do really well, and they're going to beat other kingdoms, and then the pay-to-win players don't really make the biggest difference. But when you look at 1v1s, it can be a bit of a difference there, where pay-to-wins get a big advantage because they can buy more marches. But generally, kingdoms will have an equal amount of pay-to-win free-to-plays, and they can just compete with each other in a KVK, and it's not that unequal. The only time this changes is crystal tech. The second crystal tech gets thrown into the mix, that's when you start to see a really big difference between free-to-play low spenders. Upwards of, like, I would say a pay-to-win player could destroy my mutable, even if they just use 3 marches as well, because I have a small mutable, but if they use 3 marches, they could probably destroy my mutable and get a 200% win on it just because they have more marches. But if we neglect the fact they have more marches, if they just have 3 marches, they just got way more crystal tech, it's going to be way stronger. They're going to completely demolish me. So unless I'm fighting with a mutable, I can be at a disadvantage there. But generally, free-to-play players will still fight with their mutable, and yeah, I wouldn't recommend any player, even if you're a whale, to just go off fighting on your own, because at the end of the day, the group kingdom is going to destroy a single player by themselves, because it's so many players combined into one, and with good fighting strategy, you tend to win most battles. So I think the only time the biggest free-to-play disadvantage comes in is definitely with crystal tech. Now, there are still free-to-play disadvantages in commanders and in equipment, but generally, it is not as bad and not as big as crystal tech is. So the final opinion I'd give is that the game is relatively free-to-play friendly. I'm not going to say Rise of Kingdoms is the best game out there, but it sure as hell is not the worst game I've played in terms of free-to-play friendliness. I've seen games where half the content is inaccessible or you can't beat it unless you're ridiculously skilled or you spend an absurd amount of money. And I've seen games where you just can't even access the strongest, newest content unless you spend money. A free-to-play player can still get the newest equipment, they can still get the newest commanders, they can still get the best armaments, it is just a matter of time. Some of those games, you'll pretty much never access it unless you spend that money, and I think Rise of Kingdoms is relatively good in that regard. I think the very big group aspect of Rise of Kingdoms and fighting with your kingdom generally eliminates the massive difference between free-to-play and low spenders. The only real thing is crystal tech, and I think if we want to close the gap even more between free-to-play low spenders and pay-to-wins, you want to be looking at making crystal tech a little bit weaker or making it more accessible. The biggest recommendation I'd give is make the Kurak or the KVK Crystal Kurak ceremony pretty much the way it was before, or allow people to access the Hell mode and the Nightmare mode before you get to Kingsland. And that would be the biggest thing that would just help. It would let players get that initial boost of crystals before those stages and allow them to catch up to players who are spending money a little bit better. Now, this wouldn't make it completely equal on the battlefield, but I don't think that's necessary. At the end of the day, there still needs to be an incentive to buy crystal tech. And then, the slight advantage will be that incentive for most players. But giving free-to-play low spenders the ability to catch up on crystal tech just a little bit will definitely be very good for most players. And it would definitely close that gap quite a bit. Because right now, I'd say the gap in equipment and commanders is probably about here. The gap in crystal tech is probably like above my camera if we're being fully realistic. If you close that to about here, I'd say the game is definitely going to be much more free-to-play and low-spender friendly, and a little bit more grind to win than it is pay-to-win. So in my opinion, really, Rise of Kingdoms isn't that bad. If they wanted to strive for almost perfection, I would say just reducing crystal tech is a way to achieve that, and most players would pretty much agree with me, because most people, even pay-to-win players, don't like spending money on crystal tech, because it just feels like it disappears after a little while. So now that we've made it to the end of my Yap session, I was wondering, what do you guys think about the current state of Rise of Kingdoms for free-to-plays and low spenders compared to the pay-to-win players? I'm very interested to hear both sides. I've heard a lot of free-to-play perspective, but someone who is a bit pay-to-win, how much of a difference do you think it really makes to your account? Do you think it is more game breaking than I state it is, especially in terms of commanders? Or do you think that in those big group murderballs, it tends to pretty much equalize out and the only real big difference is the crystal tech? I'm very interested to hear everyone's perspective. Tell me in the comments down below. I tend to respond to every single comment. And other than that, I just want to say thank you all for watching and I hope to see you in the next one.